He was sitting in his car on a bright afternoon, parked on a busy street where the sunlight bounced off the buildings and cars went by in steady streams. The windows were slightly rolled down, and the air smelled faintly of asphalt and spring flowers from a nearby park. He had been waiting patiently for a friend who had gone into a small store across the street. Nothing unusual had happened that day, and he thought it would be a quiet moment to relax. Maybe scroll through his phone or watch people walk by. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a police car slowly approaching. At first, he didn't think much of it. Police cars drove past all the time. He assumed it would just continue down the street. But instead, the car stopped right beside him. A uniformed officer stepped out quickly, moving with a sense of urgency that immediately made him tense. Before he could even roll the window up or ask what was happening, the officer grabbed the edge of the driver's side window and smashed it without warning. Glass exploded into the air, sparkling in the sunlight like a brief fireworks display before raining down inside the car. The sharp sound of breaking glass made him flinch. Pain shot across his hands as a few shards cut his fingers. The air suddenly smelled of broken glass and dust. He froze in disbelief, unable to understand why this was happening. The officer shouted something, but the words were lost under the ringing in his ears from the smash. His heart pounded as he tried to comprehend what he had done wrong. He had committed no crime. He had not yelled, not driven recklessly, not broken any law. He was just sitting there waiting, like he had done hundreds of times before. Yet here was an armed man standing over him, full of aggression, ready to escalate the situation further. He cautiously unbuckled his seatbelt and raised his hands slowly, trying to show he meant no harm. "Please," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't understand. What is going on?" The officer's eyes were cold and hard, and for a moment it seemed as if the man himself had vanished from the officer's mind. He was not being seen as a person, just as a potential threat. The feeling of being completely powerless pressed down on him. People on the street began to notice the commotion. A few joggers slowed down, confused. Shopkeepers peeked from behind their counters. A couple of teenagers on the sidewalk raised their phones, recording the scene, unsure what to expect. The tension was visible. The way people held their bodies, frozen half in fear and half in curiosity, told the story more clearly than words ever could. He tried to speak again. "Sir, I haven't done anything. I'm just waiting for my friend." He pointed toward the small store across the street, hoping that would make sense to the officer. But the officer seemed deaf to his words, moving closer with a hand resting on the holster at his side. There was a sense of finality in the way he approached, as if he had already decided what he thought was right and nothing else mattered. A piece of glass fell on the man's lap, and he instinctively brushed it away. His hands were trembling. He realized that at any moment things could get much worse. He was not just scared. He was terrified. Fear of pain, fear of humiliation, fear of being misunderstood. All these emotions clashed inside him, and he struggled to keep his breathing steady so he wouldn't make the officer more angry. A neighbor came closer, stepping off the sidewalk to ask what was happening. "Hey, are you okay?" she called, her voice nervous but firm. The officer didn't respond, and the man felt even more isolated, even more exposed. It was as if the world around him was watching but powerless to stop what was unfolding. The simple act of waiting for a friend had turned into a nightmare he never imagined. He remembered thinking about his family. How would they feel if something went wrong? How would he explain to them that he had not been doing anything wrong, yet still faced this sudden violence? His mind raced through possibilities, trying to find a way to calm the officer, to de-escalate the situation, to survive this encounter without it turning tragic. The officer finally barked a command, sharp and loud. "Step out of the car." It was the kind of order that demanded immediate obedience, leaving no room for explanation. His hands were still raised as he carefully opened the door, feeling every glass shard crunch beneath his fingers and against his clothes. The sound of the street seemed louder now, the hum of traffic, the murmurs of witnesses, all blending together into a chaotic backdrop for the moment. As he stepped out, the cold metal of the car door pressed against his side, and the jagged edges of the broken window reminded him that he had no protection here. People were gathering quickly. Some whispered to each other, others continued filming. The presence of witnesses was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because someone was seeing the truth. Terrifying because the officer might act differently knowing everyone could watch. He tried again, speaking calmly. though his voice wavered. "Please, sir, I'm not doing anything. I'm not a threat." But the officer's expression didn't change. There was still anger, still tension. He could feel the eyes of strangers on him, judging, worrying, uncertain. He was hyper-aware of every small movement, trying to predict what might happen next. The shattered glass on the ground reflected the sunlight, throwing little specks of brightness across the sidewalk. For a moment it almost looked beautiful, but he could not feel anything but fear and confusion. He could see small cuts forming on his hands from brushing off the glass. His shirt had tiny rips where the shards had caught. He felt exposed, fragile, and completely at the mercy of someone else's decision. The officer moved closer, reaching toward him, his stance aggressive. The man instinctively took a small step back, careful not to trip over the curb. He wanted to reason, to appeal to the officer's humanity, but words felt inadequate. All he could do was stand there open-handed, hoping that his calmness would be enough to prevent things from escalating. People on the street were whispering, some shouting, but no one stepped in. Everyone seemed unsure, frozen by the shock of seeing a man's car window smashed for no reason. Some began calling their friends, telling them to come see. Others were recording every second, realizing this was something that could not be unseen. The weight of public attention made the moment even more intense, as if the world itself had suddenly decided to watch. He thought again of his friend who had gone into the store. What would they say if they returned to this scene? He wished for them to come back, to stand beside him, to show that he was not alone. But for now he had to face this situation alone. Then a thought struck him sharply. Why had the officer chosen him? Was it the car? The neighborhood? His skin color? The questions spiraled and frustration began to build alongside fear. He wanted answers, but more than that, he wanted safety. He wanted to survive this encounter with his dignity intact. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, near his holster, and his eyes scanned the area, sharp and calculating. The man took a slow breath, forcing himself to think clearly. One wrong movement, one misunderstood gesture could turn everything worse. He tried to focus on staying calm, on using words rather than actions, even though fear made his voice shake. Finally, he took a step closer to the sidewalk, giving space between himself and the car, trying to appear non-threatening. He said again, voice steady despite the panic in his chest, "Please, sir, I'm not doing anything. I'm just waiting." The officer's gaze lingered, and for a moment time seemed to stretch. He could hear the soft hum of the city, the distant honk of a car, the faint chatter of people on the street. It all felt surreal, like he was trapped in a scene that was happening too quickly and too slowly at the same time. He noticed one witness, a young woman, holding her phone tightly, watching every second. Their eyes met briefly, and he felt a small sense of solidarity, knowing someone else was seeing the truth of what was happening. But the fear didn't leave. The danger was real, present, and immediate. And as the officer's eyes finally focused on him fully, the man realized that this moment would be remembered by everyone on the street, captured in their phones, replayed in conversations. It was no longer just about him and the officer. It was about justice, about fear, about how quickly normal life could spiral into chaos for no reason at all. He stayed calm, waiting, hoping that somehow reason would win. He did not yet know that the next moments would test him in ways he could not imagine, shaping not only what happened next, but also the way people would remember that afternoon for a long time. The shattered glass still glistened on the ground as he stepped away from his car, trying to stay calm. His hands were raised slightly, showing he meant no harm, but the tension in the air made every movement feel heavy and dangerous. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, sharp and searching, as if looking for any reason to accuse him. His chest tightened, and he took a slow, steadying breath, wishing he could disappear into the crowd that was beginning to form. People were gathering quickly, drawn by the sound of breaking glass and the harsh tone of the officer's voice. Some whispered to each other, pointing at the scene. Others held their phones high, filming what was happening, their faces a mixture of shock and concern. A few children peeked around corners, unsure if they should be scared or fascinated. The man felt the weight of every gaze upon him, both supportive and judgmental, as if the crowd's presence added to the pressure rather than relieving it. He tried to speak again, keeping his voice calm and measured, despite the fear curling in his stomach. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said. "I'm just waiting for my friend. Please, just let me explain." His words were simple, honest, but they seemed to bounce off the officer like a stone hitting concrete. The officer's expression remained hard, his stance firm, and the man could see that reasoning alone might not work. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Some people shouted at the officer, telling him to calm down or explaining that the man had done nothing. Others offered words of encouragement to the man, telling him to stay calm, that they were watching, and that everything would be okay. But the presence of witnesses did not ease the tension. It only made him more aware that one wrong move could be caught on camera and interpreted the wrong way. He noticed a small group of teenagers who had crouched down on the sidewalk, phones out, recording everything. They whispered to each other, asking questions he couldn't hear. He realized how easily an incident like this could go viral, how quickly a single misunderstanding could be shared across the city, or even the country. That thought made him even more anxious, yet he knew he had to stay composed. Panicking would only make the situation worse. The officer took a step closer and instinctively he took a step back, careful not to trip over the curb. "Step away from the car," the officer ordered, his voice firm and unyielding. He obeyed, moving to a safer distance, trying to appear non-threatening. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready to react if necessary, but he forced himself to remain still. He reminded himself that staying calm was the only way he could protect himself in this moment. A woman in the crowd, older and steady, raised her voice. "He's doing nothing wrong, leave him alone." Her words were strong, cutting through the tension. A few others echoed her sentiment, speaking to the officer, but the man knew that their voices might not reach him. The officer seemed focused on his own perception of the situation, as if he had already made up his mind. The man's mind raced, thinking about what could have led to this. Was it his car? His clothing? The fact that he was alone? He had no answer. Nothing in his behavior had invited this, yet here he was, being treated as if he were dangerous. The injustice of it made him furious, but he swallowed the anger, knowing that showing it could escalate the situation. Every word, every movement, had to be controlled. He glanced toward the store across the street where his friend had gone. They were still inside, unaware of what was unfolding outside. He wished they could come back to stand beside him, to show that he was just an ordinary person waiting, not a threat. But for now, he had to face this alone. The thought of being isolated in such a public confrontation was chilling. Suddenly, one of the bystanders, a man with a calm voice, tried to intervene. "Officer, please, he's not doing anything wrong. Step back and talk to him." The officer's eyes flicked toward the voice, but he didn't respond. The man realized that nothing around him seemed to matter to the officer, except his own perception of control. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was confusion, disbelief at how quickly a normal day could turn into this kind of nightmare. He thought about his family, about how worried they would be if they could see him now. How would they explain this? How would he explain that he was doing nothing wrong yet faced such aggression? He clenched his fists briefly, feeling a surge of helplessness, then released it, forcing his hands to stay open, showing he meant no harm. It was a small act of control in a situation where everything else felt uncontrollable. As he tried to breathe slowly, the officer's demeanor began to shift slightly. There was still tension, still suspicion, but a hint of hesitation appeared. The man noticed it, sensing a small crack in the officer's certainty. Maybe, just maybe, reason could begin to seep through. He spoke again, carefully, keeping his tone calm but firm. "I understand you have a job to do. I'm not a threat. Please let me explain." The officer paused, his eyes scanning the man's face. There was something in that gaze, a flicker of recognition that had not been there before. The man didn't fully understand it, but he could feel it, a subtle change in the energy between them. For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Witnesses leaned in slightly, phones raised, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, the officer's hand twitched slightly, and he looked around at the crowd. The murmurs were louder, now people talking to each other, questioning what they were seeing. The man realized that the presence of the crowd, the eyes watching him, was both a protection and a pressure. Everyone could see the truth, yet the pressure of so many witnesses also made each second feel longer, heavier. He tried to steady his thoughts, focusing on small details to distract himself from fear. The rough texture of the sidewalk under his shoes, the way the sunlight hit the nearby buildings, the faint scent of flowers in the air, all small anchors to reality in a moment that felt surreal. He reminded himself that staying calm, staying visible, and speaking clearly was the only way forward. A few neighbors began to speak directly to the officer, urging him to de-escalate. "You're making a mistake," one man said. "He hasn't done anything. Look at him, he's staying calm." The officer's eyes flicked toward them, and, for the first time, his posture shifted slightly. A small hesitation in his stance. The man sensed that this pause, however brief, was an opportunity. He took another careful step, keeping his hands visible. "Sir, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just waiting. Please, we can talk this through. I'll cooperate with anything you need." His words were measured, intentional. He spoke not just to the officer but to the situation itself, trying to anchor it in calm, in reason, in humanity. The officer's hand lingered near his belt for a moment, and then he lowered it slightly. He was still wary, still tense, but the immediate threat seemed to lessen. The man felt a small sense of relief, though he knew the danger was far from over. This was just the beginning of a moment that could go in many directions, and he had to remain vigilant. As the minutes passed, the crowd's presence became more pronounced. Some people whispered encouragement, others questioned what had happened, and a few continued recording, capturing every movement, every word. The man realized that this incident, small as it began, was growing in importance. It was becoming a story, a record of how quickly normal life could spiral into fear, misunderstanding, and tension. He tried to focus again on his own breathing, slowing it deliberately. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Each breath was a small act of control, a way to keep panic from overtaking him. He reminded himself that he had to stay calm, for himself, for the witnesses, and for the hope that reason could prevail. Then a thought struck him sharply. Why had the officer acted this way in the first place? Was it a misunderstanding, a misjudgment, or something deeper? He couldn't know, and speculating would not help. All he could do was continue to remain calm, visible and honest, showing with every gesture that he posed no threat. Time seemed to stretch as he stood there, facing the officer, facing the crowd, facing the unpredictability of what could happen next. He felt the pressure of public attention, the weight of being recorded, the tension of uncertainty. Every step, every word, every breath mattered. The city around them continued its rhythm, but for him, this moment felt suspended, critical, fragile. Finally, he realized that the encounter was no longer just about him and the officer. It had grown into a reflection of the community, of how quickly fear and misunderstanding could escalate, and how the presence of witnesses could influence behavior. He felt a mixture of fear, frustration, and a cautious hope that things could change if the right choices were made. And so he continued to stand, calm but alert, waiting, hoping that reason would prevail, that the officer would see the truth, and that this moment could be turned toward understanding rather than tragedy. The crowd watched, holding their breath as the story unfolded, knowing that the next moments could define how everyone involved would be remembered. The man's hands were still slightly trembling from the shock, but he tried to stand as steady as he could. Every sound on the street felt amplified: the distant honk of a car, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, the soft murmur of bystanders whispering to each other. Each moment felt heavy, stretched, like the world was holding its breath. He couldn't predict what the officer would do next, and that uncertainty made his chest tighten. He realized he had to find a way to communicate clearly, to show he was not a threat, but also to protect himself. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain again that he had done nothing wrong, when suddenly he noticed something in the officer's eyes. It wasn't anger, not entirely, it was recognition, a flicker of confusion, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. The man froze, sensing that this could change everything. It started slowly. The officer's posture softened just a little, his shoulders lowering slightly, the edge in his eyes giving way to something else, something human. For the first time, it felt like the officer was seeing him not as a potential threat but as a person, a man who was scared, a man who had been wronged. The realization came slowly, like the first rays of light piercing through a fog. The man's mind raced. Could it be possible that the officer recognized him? He had met this officer before in professional settings, brief encounters where he had introduced himself and shaken hands. It had been years, and he hadn't expected anyone to remember. But now, in the tense heat of this moment, he saw something flicker. Recognition, fear, and confusion. He took a cautious step forward, hands still raised. "Do you remember me?" he asked quietly, trying to keep his voice calm and neutral even though his heart was hammering. The crowd around them fell silent, sensing the shift in energy. The tension in the air didn't disappear, but it changed. It became fragile, delicate, full of possibility. The officer froze for a heartbeat, then his eyes widened slightly. The hardness in his face softened, and for the first time the man saw vulnerability in him. This was not just fear of what could happen next, but a real human fear. Fear of having done something wrong, fear of realizing a mistake too late. He could see it in the way the officer's jaw clenched, in the slight shaking of his hands. The man realized that this recognition could be the turning point. He spoke again, carefully choosing his words with precision. "I know you've seen me before. I've met you at events in the neighborhood, at meetings with the community. You know who I am. You don't need to do this. Please, stop and think." His voice was calm, steady, but it carried weight because it was rooted in truth. The officer's eyes darted to the crowd, then back at him. The murmurs of the bystanders grew louder, some whispering among themselves, others trying to give quiet support. "Is it really him?" one woman murmured. "I think he's the community leader. That's the man who organizes the neighborhood meetings." The information rippled through the crowd, adding to the tension and the sense that this moment was bigger than just a single encounter. The officer's body stiffened, then relaxed slightly. He took a step back almost imperceptibly, and his hands lowered a little. He looked at the man, and for the first time he seemed unsure of what to do. Recognition brought guilt, and guilt brought hesitation. He had acted on impulse, on fear, on a perception that turned out to be wrong. Now he was faced with the reality of that action, and it weighed heavily on him. The man noticed it all, the subtle changes, the flicker of uncertainty, the small steps backward. He felt a cautious sense of hope. Maybe this moment could be de-escalated. Maybe after the fear and confusion, reason and understanding could take its place. He spoke again, gently but firmly. "You don't have to keep going. I'm not a threat. You can stop now and we can talk about this. You can fix this before it goes too far." The officer's eyes welled slightly and his lips parted, almost as if he wanted to speak but didn't know the words. The crowd sensed the shift, leaning in, some holding their phones high to record, others just watching, silent and tense. The man felt a strange mix of relief and caution. Relief because the danger seemed to be lessening, and caution because he knew one wrong move could undo everything. Then the realization hit the officer fully. He had just smashed the window of a man he knew and respected, someone who had a reputation in the community for fairness, leadership, and trustworthiness. The weight of that realization was immediate and crushing. He looked around at the witnesses, at the crowd, at the broken glass at his feet, and felt the full impact of his actions. The man watched the change in the officer, seeing the human side emerge through the fear and guilt. He didn't speak this time, just held his hands out open and calm, a gesture of peace and understanding. The tension in the street began to shift slightly. The crowd sensed the officer's struggle and held its collective breath, waiting to see how he would respond to the realization. Finally, the officer spoke, his voice low, almost trembling. I didn't recognize you. I didn't know. I thought you were someone else." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of shock, guilt, and regret. The man nodded slowly, acknowledging the honesty without letting down his guard entirely. He had to remain cautious, but he could feel the first small steps toward resolution. The officer's hands shook as he looked at the shattered glass, at the damage he had caused, and then back at the man. "I made a huge mistake," he admitted. "I don't know what I was thinking. I shouldn't have done this. I'm sorry." The man's chest tightened, but he remained still. The apology was a start, but it didn't erase the fear or the shock. Still, it was a sign that the human side of the officer had emerged, and that gave him hope. The bystanders whispered among themselves, some expressing relief, others shock. "He's actually apologizing. one woman said quietly. I didn't think he would. The energy in the street shifted from tension to a strange mix of caution and anticipation. Everyone could feel that the moment was moving, that the encounter was changing from a confrontation into something different. The man finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. But words aren't enough. You need to understand the harm you've done, the fear you've caused. The officer nodded, swallowing hard, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged with something difficult but real: understanding, accountability, and the possibility of change. The officer took a deep breath, and for the first time he looked small, human, not just a uniformed figure of authority. The man could see the weight of guilt pressing on him, the realization that actions had consequences and that recognition, once missed, could lead to tragedy if not corrected. It was a lesson that cut through the fear, straight to the core of what had happened that afternoon. The crowd remained quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. Phones still recorded, eyes still watched, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer just fear, it was reflection. Witnesses felt the weight of seeing something rare, an officer confronting his mistake, realizing the truth and beginning to show humility in a public space. The man took a cautious step closer, keeping his hands open and visible. You can fix this, he said gently. It won't erase what happened, but you can make it right. Start by being honest with yourself, with me, and with everyone watching. The officer nodded again, the weight of understanding heavy on his shoulders. He felt the tension slowly begin to release, replaced by a fragile hope. Hope that this moment could lead to something better, that it could serve as a reminder of the importance of seeing people clearly, not through assumptions or fear. The man realized that while the encounter had been terrifying, it had also opened a doorway, a chance for recognition, accountability, and perhaps even reconciliation. For the first time since the window had been smashed, he felt a small measure of relief. The officer was no longer acting purely on impulse or fear. He was aware, human, and accountable. The path forward was uncertain, but at least it existed. And in that moment, with the crowd watching and the sun shining down, the man felt the possibility of change, not just for the officer, but for everyone who had witnessed the event, for the community, and for himself. The officer's eyes met his again, filled with a mix of fear, guilt, and something else. Hope, perhaps, or the first spark of humility. It was a moment that would stay with both of them, a turning point that reminded them of the fragility and complexity of human interactions. The man realized that this afternoon, this terrifying encounter had become more than just an incident. It had become a lesson, a moment of recognition that could shape how people treated each other in the future. And as the man stood there, calm but alert, surrounded by shattered glass, witnesses, and the quiet hum of the city, he knew that the story was far from over. The officer had recognized him, and that recognition had changed everything. But the journey toward resolution, understanding, and forgiveness was only beginning. The officer took a deep, shuddering breath, and the air between them grew quieter, almost reverent in its tension. The man stood still, hands open and relaxed now, sensing that the moment was shifting again. The officer's eyes flicked to the shattered glass at his feet, then back at the man, and he seemed smaller somehow. Not in size, but in the weight of what he carried. Guilt, shame, fear, and regret pressed heavily on his shoulders. He looked around at the crowd, and for the first time, his awareness of them felt real. He could see the eyes of bystanders, the cameras, the whispers, all taking in the scene unfolding. But he wasn't thinking about appearances anymore. He was thinking about the man in front of him, the person he had wronged, and the truth of what he had done. I don't know what I was thinking, the officer said, his voice low and shaky. He took a step forward, and the man instinctively stepped back, cautious but patient. I should never have done that. I had no right. I can't even explain why I acted the way I did. He swallowed hard, then closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage for what he needed to do next. Then, slowly, deliberately, the officer sank to his knees on the pavement. The crowd gasped softly, a wave of murmurs moving through them. The man froze, unsure how to react. It was a gesture he had rarely, if ever, seen from someone in uniform, and it carried weight beyond words. The officer's posture was not demanding forgiveness. It was pleading, humbling himself in a way that seemed almost raw, almost sacred. "I am so sorry," the officer said, voice breaking. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. I acted out of fear, ignorance, and, I don't know, prejudice. I see that now and I am ashamed. Please, I beg for your forgiveness." His eyes were fixed on the man's face, pleading, vulnerable, completely human. The man's chest tightened at the scene. His heart pounded and he felt a swirl of emotions: anger, relief, disbelief, and a strange flicker of understanding. He had been terrified, hurt, and humiliated, and yet here was a human being before him, admitting his mistake, laying himself bare in front of witnesses. The complexity of the moment struck him. Fear could turn into guilt, aggression into humility, misunderstanding into acknowledgement. He kept his hands open, careful not to make sudden movements. He didn't speak immediately. He watched, letting the officer's words settle in the air, letting the crowd absorb the unexpected humility. People whispered quietly among themselves. "I've never seen that before," one woman said. "He's really kneeling. He's really apologizing." Others nodded, their faces a mix of surprise and respect. The street had gone from tension and fear to something heavier, more meaningful. The man realized he had a choice. He could respond with anger, with confrontation, with the raw emotions that had been simmering inside him since the window was smashed. Or he could remain composed, human, and allow the moment to serve its purpose, a chance for accountability, reflection, and growth. He chose the latter, taking a measured breath before speaking. "I hear you," he said softly, his voice calm but firm. "I hear what you're saying, and I can see that you understand what you did. You don't get to erase what happened, but this honesty, it's a start." He paused, letting the words sink in. People need to see moments like this. They need to see that even those in power can admit mistakes, that it's possible to take responsibility even when it's hard. The officer's shoulders shook as he listened. Tears welled in his eyes and he pressed his palms together in a silent gesture of regret. He wasn't expecting forgiveness. He was not entitled to it. He was simply showing his human side, exposing vulnerability in a way that felt terrifying but necessary. The man recognized the courage in that, even while he kept the hurt he had felt alive in his mind. Around them, the crowd shifted. Some people lowered their phones, unable to record the emotional intensity any longer. Others whispered to friends, commenting on how rare it was to witness such a public display of humility. Children stared wide-eyed, seeing a side of human behavior they rarely encountered: acknowledgement, apology, and vulnerability. The street felt suspended in time, a space where lessons about humanity were unfolding live. The man took a careful step closer, his eyes meeting the officer's. "I want you to understand something," he said. "This isn't just about you and me. It's about every person who has ever been judged, threatened, or harmed by assumptions and fear. It's about accountability, and it's about learning from the moments that scare us the most. You've taken the first step, but the work is just beginning." The officer nodded, swallowing hard. He lifted his gaze slightly, his expression still heavy with shame, but the raw emotion softened into something else. A determination, perhaps, to make things right. "I will learn," he said quietly. "I promise. I will do everything I can to understand, to change, and to make sure this never happens again. I don't want to be the person I was in that moment. I want to do better." The man watched him, measuring the sincerity of his words. He could see the struggle within the officer, the weight of self-awareness pressing down on him. It was uncomfortable, vulnerable, and intensely human. And in that moment he realized that fear and guilt could create a bridge if met with honesty and courage. The officer stayed on his knees for a moment longer, then slowly stood. He didn't rush, didn't try to regain authority with posture or tone. He was careful, deliberate, aware of the power dynamic he had once abused and now needed to repair. He took a deep breath and looked at the man with a level of respect that hadn't been present minutes before. Around them, the crowd exhaled almost collectively. The tension that had gripped the street eased slightly, replaced by awe, relief, and reflection. Some people began whispering to friends, commenting on the human bravery of an apology that was so rare, so complete. Others still recorded, knowing this was a moment that carried lessons far beyond the incident itself. The man kept his eyes on the officer, still cautious but open. "I know it's not easy to admit mistakes," he said. "It takes courage, and it takes more than words, it takes action. If you really want to make this right, it's not about me. It's about how you treat people every day, how you think about your actions, and how you respond when fear or bias tries to take control. The officer nodded again, absorbing each word. His expression was one of concentration, of commitment to truly hearing the message. He took another deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on him but also offering a strange relief. He had faced the consequences of his actions in the eyes of the man he had wronged, and the witnesses who had watched it all unfold. The man's voice softened slightly, almost as if speaking to himself and the officer at the same time. This moment doesn't have to define you as a person. It can define how you change. And that change matters not just for you, but for everyone who sees it. Actions like this, they're powerful. They teach lessons that words alone cannot. The officer's eyes filled with tears, his body trembling slightly as he nodded. He didn't speak immediately. He only listened, letting the weight of the man's words sink in. And in that silence, a fragile understanding formed. The officer was no longer just an aggressor. He was a human, flawed and frightened, but capable of seeing the truth and taking responsibility for it. The man took a slow step back, giving the officer space, letting him rise fully to his feet. He could see that humility had replaced aggression, and that fear had transformed into something more manageable: awareness, accountability, and a desire to do better. Around them, the crowd seemed to hold its breath, witnessing the rare unfolding of human honesty in a public moment. Finally, the officer spoke, voice quieter now, but steady. "I'm sorry, truly. I will learn from this. I will be better. I want to make amends, not just with you, but with anyone who might be affected by my actions in the future." The man nodded slowly, letting him know that his words were heard. Forgiveness wasn't immediate, it wasn't simple, but acknowledgement and commitment to change were a start. The street felt heavy but lighter at the same time, the air carrying the weight of tension and the beginnings of resolution. People whispered quietly to each other, some wiping tears, some shaking their heads in disbelief, but all feeling the gravity of what had unfolded. The man realized that this afternoon, terrifying as it had been, was becoming more than an incident. It was becoming a lesson, a story of human fallibility, courage, and the fragile power of humility. He spoke once more, calmly, clearly. Actions like this can make a difference if we let them. It's not just about apology. It's about what comes next: understanding, awareness, and respect for everyone. That's how change begins. The officer nodded, taking in every word, committing himself silently to live by them. And in that moment, with the sun shining, the broken glass on the ground, the witnesses around them, and the air heavy with emotion, a fragile but real bridge began to form between them, a bridge built from humility, acknowledgement, and the willingness to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. After the officer's apology, the energy on the street began to shift. The tension that had gripped everyone slowly eased, replaced by a mix of reflection, curiosity, and a cautious sense of hope. People in the crowd whispered quietly to each other, sharing their thoughts about what had just happened. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others wiped away tears, and a few simply stared, absorbing the weight of the moment. The man remained calm, standing slightly apart from the officer. He knew the situation wasn't fully resolved, but he could feel that something had changed. The officer was no longer acting purely out of fear or aggression. He had acknowledged his mistake and shown humility, which was rare and significant. The man realized that this moment was bigger than the two of them. It was a lesson for everyone watching, a reminder that accountability and honesty could have real power. People started approaching cautiously, speaking to the man, asking if he was all right. "Are you hurt?" one woman asked gently, glancing at the glass on the ground. "You're okay, right?" Another man nodded in agreement, offering quiet support. The man shook his head, trying to calm them. "I'm fine," he said softly. "Thank you. I'm more shaken than hurt. The important thing is that this can be a moment to reflect and learn." The crowd began to discuss the incident openly. Some were angry at the officer, pointing out how easily fear and assumptions could escalate into violence. Others expressed relief that the situation had not turned worse, acknowledging the courage it took for the officer to apologize publicly. People debated, questioned, and reflected, creating a dialogue that hadn't existed before the incident. Nearby, a young man who had recorded the event on his phone lowered it, turning to speak to his friends. "Did you see that?" he said. He actually admitted he was wrong. That doesn't happen often. His friends nodded, their expressions a mixture of admiration and skepticism. The recordings, they realized, could now serve as a reminder of both accountability and the possibility of change. The man noticed the officer standing quietly nearby, still processing what had just happened. The uniform no longer felt like a shield of authority. It now seemed like a burden, a symbol of responsibility. The officer's hands were clasped together, his eyes fixed on the ground, and he occasionally glanced at the man with a mixture of remorse and determination. It was clear that he was beginning to understand the impact of his actions on not just the man, but the community around them. The man took a deep breath and addressed the crowd. "What just happened here is more than an apology. It's a reminder that we all make mistakes and how we respond to them matters. Accountability isn't just a word, it's action, and it's a choice we make every day." His words resonated through the street, quiet but powerful. People listened, some nodding, some reflecting silently, and others murmuring their agreement. Nearby, someone asked the officer if he understood why the man had been scared and hurt. The officer nodded slowly, his voice quiet. "I do. I see now how my actions caused fear and harm. I didn't think about the consequences in the moment, and I acted out of fear and poor judgment. I regret it deeply." The man nodded, acknowledging the honesty. "That's the first step," he said. "The next is showing it through your actions." The community began to discuss what could be done moving forward. Conversations arose about training, awareness, and how to prevent incidents like this in the future. Neighbors spoke about programs to improve understanding between law enforcement and the people they serve. The man encouraged them to think beyond blame and anger, focusing instead on constructive dialogue and meaningful change. Local news reporters, who had arrived during the incident, began asking questions. The man spoke clearly, calmly, explaining the importance of accountability and understanding. He emphasized that the officer's public apology was significant, but the real work came after, through consistent actions and community engagement. The reporters listened attentively, capturing the story not just as a confrontation, but as a lesson in humility, reflection, and growth. People in the crowd began to approach the officer as well, some cautiously, some openly. A few spoke directly to him about the fear and hurt caused by assumptions and bias. Others offered words of encouragement, acknowledging the courage it took to kneel, apologize, and face the consequences. The officer listened quietly, nodding and occasionally speaking briefly, accepting the feedback without defensiveness. The man stood near him, observing how the officer absorbed each interaction. He felt a cautious sense of hope. Moments like this were rare, where a person in a position of authority could confront their mistakes publicly and begin a path toward real change. It was a reminder that accountability, honesty, and humility were not just ideals. They could be lived, even in difficult circumstances. A neighbor approached the man and said, "You handled this so calmly. I don't think I could have." He shook his head in disbelief, impressed by the composure he had seen. The man smiled faintly, shaking his head. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "I was scared, hurt, and angry, but staying calm and measured was the only way I could protect myself and make sure the situation didn't get worse." It also gave the officer a chance to see the truth and take responsibility. The officer, standing a few steps away, watched the exchange quietly. He seemed to absorb every word, every gesture, realizing the human impact of his actions. The man approached him once more and said, "You have a choice now. You can let this define you in a negative way, or you can use it to grow, to improve, to learn. Your actions going forward matter far more than what happened today." The officer nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand," he said quietly. "I won't forget this moment. I will do better, not just for myself, but for everyone I interact with in the future." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of commitment and awareness. The man glanced around at the crowd again, sensing the shift in energy. What had begun as fear, confusion, and tension was transforming into reflection, understanding, and dialogue. People were no longer just witnesses. They were participants in a moment that had the potential to inspire change. Conversations began to focus on solutions, on building trust, and on preventing similar incidents in the future. A few children lingered nearby, curious and wide-eyed. One whispered to another, "Why did he kneel?" The other shrugged, equally uncertain. The man smiled faintly and leaned down slightly. Sometimes people admit when they've done wrong to show that they want to be better. It's not easy, but it's important. The children nodded, absorbing the lesson in their own way, realizing that accountability and humility were part of being human. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, the man felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The immediate danger had passed, but the lessons of the day were profound. He realized that fear and misunderstanding could escalate quickly, but so could recognition, honesty, and humility. The choice of how to respond, whether as a victim or as someone seeking understanding, could change the course of an event entirely. The officer approached him one final time, standing quietly and respectfully. "I don't expect forgiveness yet," he said. "I just want you to know I'm committed to learning from this. I will take responsibility for my actions and work to do better." The man nodded, understanding that true accountability was not instant. It was ongoing, and it required consistent effort. The crowd slowly began to disperse, carrying with them a sense of reflection and the awareness that they had witnessed something meaningful. People spoke to one another about what they had seen, about how rare it was for someone in authority to confront their mistake publicly, and about the lessons they could carry into their own lives. The man looked at the officer one last time before turning to leave. "Remember," he said quietly, "it's not the apology alone that matters. It's what you do every day after that. That's how trust is rebuilt, and that's how change happens." The officer nodded solemnly, committing himself silently to the promise he had made. As the man walked away, he felt a cautious hope for the future. The incident would not be forgotten, but it had transformed from a frightening confrontation into a moment of reflection, dialogue, and the possibility of real change. The city around them continued its rhythm, unaware of the lessons unfolding on that street. But the people who had witnessed it would carry them forward, sharing them, discussing them, and remembering them. He realized that this was not just a story about fear or mistake. It was a story about accountability, humility, and the human capacity to acknowledge wrongdoing and choose to be better. The officer had knelt, admitted his mistakes, and shown vulnerability in a way that few people ever did. And while the path ahead would be long and require consistent effort, the moment had planted the seed for change, not just for him, but for everyone who had watched, listened, and reflected. The man paused briefly, taking one last look at the officer, who now stood upright but solemn, aware of the weight of the day's events. The sun dipped lower, casting warm light over the street as if marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. And in that quiet, reflective moment, the man felt a sense of cautious optimism. Even in the midst of fear, confusion, and harm, accountability and humility could prevail. Actions could be corrected, mistakes could be acknowledged, and trust could slow. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the street, and a quiet settled over the area. The shattered glass from the car still sparkled faintly in the golden light, a reminder of what had happened, but also a marker of what had changed. The man stood near the sidewalk, hands relaxed but alert, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. Every moment felt heavy with lessons, both personal and shared. He looked at the officer, who was standing a few steps away, no longer on guard, but still visibly carrying the weight of the day. The uniform that had once felt like a symbol of authority now seemed like a reminder of responsibility. The officer's shoulders were tense, but his posture had softened, and there was a quiet determination in his eyes. He had faced the consequences of his actions, and now he seemed to understand the responsibility that came with his position in a deeper way. The man took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. He thought about how fear and misunderstanding had escalated the situation, how quickly a routine moment could spiral into chaos. Yet he also thought about the power of human connection, of recognition, and of accountability. The way the officer had knelt, admitted his mistake, and spoken honestly had changed everything. It hadn't erased what happened, but it had opened the door to understanding. Around them, the crowd had begun to disperse slowly. People still whispered to one another, sharing reflections and lessons. Some continued to record quietly, knowing that the moment would resonate far beyond the street. Others simply walked away, absorbed in their own thoughts, carrying the story in their minds as a reminder of human fallibility and courage. The man noticed children lingering, curious and wide-eyed, learning silently about humility and accountability in ways that no classroom could teach. He glanced at the officer, who had taken a few careful steps closer. "I hope you understand now," the man said softly, "that trust is built over time, through consistent actions, not just words. You've shown courage in admitting your mistake, but the real work is what comes next." The officer nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand," he said quietly. "I will do better. I will take responsibility for every decision and action moving forward. I want to earn back the trust I've damaged, not just with you, but with the people I serve." His voice carried a weight of sincerity, the kind that comes from confronting one's own flaws without excuse. The man allowed himself a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not completely, but it was a start. He realized that true resolution didn't come instantly. It came through patience, through observation of consistent behavior, through the ongoing effort to make amends and learn. Today had been a beginning, and tomorrow would bring the next steps. As he stood there, he thought about the community, the witnesses, the conversations that had begun on that street. He realized that moments like this could ripple outward, affecting people in ways that couldn't be measured immediately. Someone in the crowd might carry this lesson to their workplace, to their family, or to someone else in need of guidance. The encounter had transformed from a confrontation into a quiet, living lesson about accountability, humility, and the human capacity for growth. The officer spoke again, his voice quieter now, reflective. "I want to do something to make this right, not just for you, but for the community. I know I can't erase what I did, but I want to take steps to ensure it never happens again. I want to listen, to learn, and to be better." The man considered the words carefully. They were not empty promises. They carried the weight of reflection, of having faced one's own mistakes in the eyes of those affected. "That's a start," he said slowly. "Change isn't easy, but it's possible if you commit to it fully. Listen, reflect, act. That's the way forward." Around them, a few bystanders approached cautiously, some offering words of encouragement, others sharing their own experiences with fear, misunderstanding, or accountability. The man encouraged dialogue, letting people speak openly, facilitating a moment where the community could engage with the lessons of the day. It was raw and imperfect, but it was honest. One woman in the crowd spoke up. "I've seen people in authority refuse to admit mistakes. This is different. It gives me hope that things can change if people take responsibility." Her words echoed in the quiet street, a reminder that courage and honesty could inspire beyond the immediate moment. The man nodded, reflecting on the power of such moments. He realized that fear and aggression could escalate quickly, but so could acknowledgement and humility. The officer's actions had transformed the tension, and the community's presence had amplified the significance of honesty and accountability. What had begun as a frightening incident had now become a shared lesson in human behavior and responsibility. He turned back to the officer. "The people you serve will notice your actions more than your words. Make sure every choice, every interaction reflects the understanding you've gained today. That's how trust is rebuilt." The officer met his gaze steadily. "I will, I promise. I will hold myself accountable and work every day to do better. Today has been a wake-up call, and I won't forget it." The man felt a sense of cautious relief. This wasn't the end, but it was a meaningful step. He realized that accountability was a journey, not a single act. The officer had taken a critical step, facing not just the consequences of his actions, but the deeper lessons about fear, judgment, and humanity. The man knew that observing consistent effort in the coming days would be the true measure of change. As the crowd thinned further, a quiet calm settled over the street. The man looked at the city around him, the buildings, the passing cars, the scattered pedestrians. Life continued as it always did, but he understood that moments like these could leave a lasting impression. They reminded people of the fragility of trust, the power of humility, and the importance of accountability. The officer stepped forward slightly, his voice quiet but sincere. "I will do better. I will make this right, not for show, but because it's the right thing to do. I will take this lesson into every interaction, every decision, every day." The man nodded. "Then the work begins. Words matter, but actions matter more. Show people what accountability looks like. Let your actions speak louder than the mistakes of the past." The officer's eyes reflected understanding and determination. "I will. Thank you for showing me a path forward even after the harm I caused. I will take responsibility for everything I can from this point on. As the man walked away, he felt the weight of the day lift slightly, replaced by a sense of purpose and reflection. He knew that fear, anger, and misunderstanding could surface at any moment, but he also knew that acknowledgement, humility, and consistent effort could transform those moments into lessons. The incident had been frightening, humbling, and painful, but it had also been a rare opportunity for growth, for both the officer and the community. He glanced back once more at the officer, who now stood alone but upright, a figure shaped by the events of the day. The uniform no longer felt like a shield but a responsibility, a reminder of the potential to influence lives for better or worse. And the officer seemed to understand that, carrying the lessons in a way that words alone could not convey. The man continued down the street, the echoes of voices, whispers, and reflections following him. He realized that this day would stay with him, a memory of fear transformed into understanding, of confrontation transformed into dialogue, and of wrongdoing transformed into a path for accountability. In the days that followed, the community would speak about what had happened. People would share the story of an incident that could have ended in anger or violence, but instead became a lesson in human behavior, responsibility, and humility. The officer's actions had been publicly witnessed, and the acknowledgement of his mistake became a tangible example of accountability for everyone who heard about it. The man understood that forgiveness was not immediate, and trust was not instantly rebuilt. But the potential for change existed, and it began with honesty, reflection, and consistent action. The officer had taken the first critical step, and now it was up to him to follow through day by day, interaction by interaction. As the evening deepened and the city lights began to flicker on, the man reflected on the full arc of the day. Fear had escalated into aggression. Recognition had shifted the balance. Humility had emerged, opening the door for accountability. And now, the possibility for understanding, change, and growth existed. It was fragile, uncertain, and challenging, but it was real. And in that quiet moment, he felt a sense of cautious hope, knowing that even in the midst of fear, injustice, and mistakes, the human capacity for reflection, apology, and positive action could prevail. The street, once tense and chaotic, now felt like a place where lessons had been learned, a place where accountability had taken root, and where the possibility of a better future could grow. The man walked on, carrying with him the knowledge that moments like these mattered, that courage, honesty, and accountability could shape the lives of many, far beyond the boundaries of a single street. And as he disappeared into the city, the story of that afternoon remained, a living example of what it meant to face mistakes, acknowledge them, and commit to a better way forward.